Al and Juddy, and this is another episode of Seed Dating, the podcast where you get to meet one of Agricom's forage products, learn about its attributes, and match it to your farm system. And here to nurture this new blossoming relationship is your very own forage relationship expert, Alistair Moorhead. Hi Al, and who are we going to meet today?
Well, Juddy, take a good look around in all directions because today we're going to meet 360 diploid perennial ryegrass.
A 360 degree view of 360 perennial ryegrass. I see what you did there, Al.
360 is a stunning grass to look at, especially in late spring, Juddy.
So tell me a little bit about the backstory. Where did this grass come from?
Well, it stems back quite a way because one of my long-term favourites and a grass that I had a lot to do with in the early 2000s was another funky name called 150. And a few listeners might recognise that because it's been used widely around New Zealand over the years. And that product has needed a successor for a very long time. So to get that right was a big deal for me. And so I spent a lot of time watching the breeding programs, late flowering category. And that's something that's caught my eye at a really critical point of time.
Because I actually remember the original 150 when I actually first, this shows how long plant breeding takes. It was probably the first grass that I recognised, the 150, that I recognised was different from all the other stuff that was green.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the industry doesn't quite recognise still is that when people seek out and talk about genetic gain in ryegrasses, one of the things that they probably still don't acknowledge as part of genetic gain has been actually utilising late genetics that are winter active in the New Zealand context, because the late flowering genetics around the world is quite common and very, very common. In fact, pretty much New Zealand's still quite early when it comes to lates around the world, but most of the world hasn't valued winter activity as much as New Zealand, being an outdoor temperate grazing system. And so you go back to the moment you started work in the early 2000s and pretty much 90% of all grasses in New Zealand were much, much earlier than we have today and earlier in heading and poorer in spring pasture quality.
Yeah. And so tell me specifically about 360 diploid perennial ryegrass. What sets that apart from some of our other traditional grasses, say?
Well, you know, after working with 150 for many, many years, you sort of work out what the strengths of that sort of category is, and then you also work out what are the weaknesses. And the strengths have always been summer activity for a perennial ryegrass. So this type of genetics needed to be as good as particularly diploid perennial ryegrass could be in summertime, recognising the temperature barriers to growth of ryegrass. We can't change what ryegrass is. We can extend it into the hottest of its tolerances, but actually going past those tolerances is pretty hard without changing species. And so that's summer activity. And, 360 for me was just another one of these moments when you can go through dozens, if not, dozens and dozens of genetics and actually see bright green, strong grass in summertime and amongst other grasses. That is something that we found with 150 back in the early 2000s, and it's very much something that still stood out in a modern generation when we went looking with that. The second point being spring activity. You tend to find as your flowering dates push further out, your spring vigor, your extra spring growth in early spring, and by my definition of early spring, I'm talking September and October. This is a time when the onset of reproductive development or elongation sort of creates a little bit of extra momentum. And of course, the super lates are all quality at this time, and therefore they're not boosting on. And when I say super lates, I mean traditional later type material. They're not boosting ahead at this time. And so seeing 360 compete in early spring, September, October spring growth, when it is actually quite flat as a style because it's vegetative, but its density and its actual yield, the amount of drymatter there for animals to eat, although it looks shorter, it's because it's vegetative, while other things might be elongating, which make them look taller. But it has yielded really well compared to 150 at that moment.
So I guess what you're saying is, as an upgrade to 150, you've probably plugged some of the, maybe not Achilles heels, but some of the attributes where 150 wasn't the strongest.
Correct. And I feel we had to get the first one right, which has made it stood out, which is that summer and early autumn performance and vigor. It means so much to so many different farming systems, but particularly anything that has access to some summer moisture and some irrigation. It's just about converting that little bit of summer moisture, that irrigation at a hot time of year, and converting it to genuinely strong amounts of yield at a time when the grasses are hardening off, struggling to get through, late 20-degree days and relatively high nighttime temperatures for a temperate environment. So
in farm systems where you were driving for late spring, summer quality in your ryegrass, this would have to tick some boxes.
Oh yeah, if you now come back to the flowering date characteristic, absolutely. But what I would say is much of the temperate pasture community would take that for granted now. This is normal.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the point I'm really making is, we're making it sound as if this is not normal. The bigger norm in New Zealand now is these leafy types that go all the way through November, or most of November leafy. This particular grass is a particularly leafy set of genetics though, and it really, under a dairy rotation, you will never see a seed head on it. It will continue to grow vegetatively pretty much the whole growing season unless you shut it up for silage, and probably even early October, early November. And if you don't shut it up, then you probably won't see any seed heads on it at all.
Wow. Any management tips? What are the things that from a management point of view that might be a little bit different to your standard grasses?
Well, that's a really good question. But straight after the statement I've just made is that I've just told you that under a well-managed system, you won't see much seed head on 360. But like all later material that are well managed and don't have a lot of seed head through the grazing phase, it doesn't mean those seed heads didn't develop. It doesn't mean those seed heads are not going to lignify. They just may have been grazed inside the canopy of a vegetative crop, but the stalks are still there. And so what you tend to find is any pseudostem mass associated with the onset of reproductive development that's been managed, that pseudostem, or the stalky bits basically left behind from the emerging seed heads that then lignify. Even though the seed heads haven't come out, you've eaten them as forage, high quality forage. Once the tops have come off them though, they then die and become lignified. What they are doing is they're building up like a grazing barrier in the base of your pasture through December and early January. And so at a certain point in December with particularly decent late plus 20 type genetics, you really do need to hit a low residual at some point in that early December window, because that's the time that you set your future residuals for summer. Otherwise, they just get higher and higher and spongier because the cows and sheep and beef cattle do not want to push their noses into stalks. Even though you haven't got a sea of seed head in the paddock, you've got a sea of stems in the base of your vegetative pasture.
So how would you do that? You could do that by silaging?
Yeah, silaging, but you'd have to be on a runoff or probably in a sheep and beef operation that's got a surplus at that key point of time. I think the reality is that in a dairy system, I honestly think that's a window of time that you may be past mating, and it would be one window of time that if you have the chance, you should be aiming to target your residual just a little bit harder at that moment, recognizing that there's a risk that you'll hit the vat and you don't want to ever do that. But my point being is if you don't do it with the cows, you'll probably want to do it at some point, and possibly later in the summer you'll be forced to do it, and then you'll be asking yourself, why am I topping in summertime? I've had a bad choice of variety, when actually it's a moment, and that moment is December, and maybe the pretty much December you set that residual. Topping prior to grazing is a technique, one that probably has not a huge amount of economic evidence to suggest it's a great idea for even improving animal intake, but the reality is it would set up the rest of summer as a really strong quality base for a product like 360.
Ding. Well, 360 perennial ryegrass does seem to be a very impressive grass, Al.
It is, I guess, with outstanding summer and autumn performance and late quality, Juddy.
Well, today I'm going to identify as someone who loves a high-powered pasture, probably from a dairy farm, and I want to maintain quality right throughout the summer, so I'll be swiping right. You've been listening to another episode of Seed Dating with Al and Juddy. Hope you can catch another episode real soon.